Well, at the end of this book, I don't want to dwell on the minutia of Alasdair MacIntyre's argument in After Virtue. I want to dwell on the takeaways for people who want to build community again, who want to build it in a way that's compatible with the 21st century, in a way that moves us past some of the harm that the neoliberal system has produced. And so that's what I'm going to talk about this evening. I've gone through the rest of the book, so I've made my way through chapter 18. And I will remind you that for me, an awful lot of this book is about a critique of what I would call, and many others would call, neoliberalism. I don't think MacIntyre uses that term, but that's what he's talking about. One of the things I like about MacIntyre is that at the most basic level, he is willing to make the argument that the measure of a system of ethics is how well it works, and that that's a good reason for looking at history and the historical development of a moral system and its disintegration. And then, what we see from history is a proving ground, right, for how a particular view of ethics or morality works. And what we see from history, according to MacIntyre, is the disintegration starting in and around probably the 16th century with modernity, the disintegration of an older way of viewing community, viewing work, viewing morality and ethics that was more coherent. And what we see is this disintegration produces a moral confusion. Towards the end of the book, he actually says that we are in a sort of dark ages. We just don't recognize it. Maybe just as the people who lived in the prior dark ages didn't recognize it. We don't recognize it because we don't have the words to describe it, and it's hard, just as it's hard for people in any era to look outside of that era and really be objective about their situation, to know what's missing. How do you know what's missing when you don't have a real memory understanding of what came before? So in his critique of neoliberalism, which I take as central, a lot of people who look at this book dwell upon his treatment of the virtues themselves, but at least half of this book is about the critique of neoliberalism. Here's a quote. He says, "It is a history, one aspect of which is the transformation of forms of social life, the continuously reestablished dominance of markets, factories, and finally bureaucracies over individuals, themselves sometimes conceived of as independent rational beings, prescribing their moral standpoint to themselves, and sometimes as anomic or uprooted products of circumstances whose happiness must be contrived for them." And in fact, that's one of the confusions of our times, is that we see ourselves both as individual rational beings who have autonomy, and at the same time, we concede that we are products of our circumstances and largely not in control because of our upbringing or the milieu in which we live, and so on and so forth. In other words, MacIntyre is very good at uncovering the incoherence of modern thought. Another big point that he makes is that neoliberalism, again, the term I'm using, fragments practices and makes it so that the practices that people do not lend themselves to the development of virtues and do not lend themselves to the development of the overall character of either individuals or groups or nations. Practices, according to the virtue ethics framework that MacIntyre develops, are supposed to lead towards the virtues. In order to do a practice well, one needs to practice certain virtues. So, for instance, if one is a farmer, Some of the virtues involved would, of course, be hard work and observation, keen observation, problem solving, in order to nurture the land, okay, to take care of it well so that it will continue to be productive. A farmer, a true farmer, has to observe many, many things and has to be pretty attuned to the particular land on which he or she is growing food or raising livestock. And so, as that person develops as a farmer, they experience within themselves a transformation because they hone and hone and hone these qualities of themselves to be the very best farmer they can be. And if you've ever been really good at any skill, you'll know that at a certain point, it's hard to even break down the constituent elements of that skill, and it becomes second nature to yourself, and you learn and you grow and you develop organically as you interact with the skill. Carpentry would be a great example of this as well. So a skilled carpenter will get to the point where his skills of problem solving and precision and mathematical skills and aesthetic skills are so well developed that he or she does not have to even really think about those constituent elements. They're all kind of working at the same time, and the skill becomes so well developed that it's just second nature. A doctor, maybe some of the qualities involved have to be caring, problem solving again, empathy, and a keen mind, of course, to learn all the things that are continually coming his way. So, but what we find in neoliberalism is that even these jobs, these are great examples of what MacIntyre is talking about, because even these jobs that used to involve the development of a lot of personal qualities that one had to and did develop inwardly have become very shrunken, I guess you might say, in their scope. So the farmer now follows a recipe. The large-scale monocrop farmer follows the recipe given to him by the seed company and by the fertilizer company and so on and so forth, and does one thing over and over again in a kind of factory-like fashion. The carpenter is producing a house that he's been involved in producing many, many times, because it's basically prefabricated. Maybe not actually prefabricated, but the design is uniform. So whole neighborhoods are built with the same basic house with slight changes that are also programmed in. Color and which side the porch is on and so forth. But the carpenter doesn't have to think as much. So in other words, and same thing with a doctor. For instance, now we have doctors we have specialists of the most minute kind. The people who are involved in actually listening to the patient and caring about them might be a social worker, might be the nurse practitioner, might be the general physician, but the specialist looks at everything that he's seeing as a fixed project with a beginning and an end, and maybe sometimes doesn't see the individual that they're treating. They can also be sort of seen as employees of the insurance company, of the state, of the co-op, whatever it may be. Anyway, the fragmentation, the breaking down of roles that our economy now requires to make things ever more efficient takes a lot of the humanity and the skill, the really organic quality skill that it takes to do these things out of the equation. That's the beauty of it, but also the curse of it. So the farmer is no longer the husbandman, and the carpenter is more of a part of the operation, a sort of part of the machine, you might say, instead of the artist and the problem solver that a carpenter can be. And if they aren't those things, then they can't develop the inner strength and the qualities that really are the payoff of practicing the virtues required for their profession. So inner integrity is the result of working on yourself and developing yourself as whatever it is, the doctor, the farmer, the carpenter, but also as a human being, as a citizen, because as we'll see, we're social animals, right? And as a citizen, as a human being involved in a community, how can we develop those inner qualities if all of our roles and purposes are fragmented? So this is something that neoliberalism does that stands in the way of developing integrity. He talks about neoliberalism crippling community. So this follows from what's already been said, but he actually brings up the subject of patriotism. And he says that in a neoliberal, again, my language system, loyalty to country does not make any real sense, because loyalty in the human sense is loyalty to other human beings that you have some sort of affection for, some sort of agreement with. But in the liberal or neoliberal system, the social contract, the idea there is you're basically agreeing with autonomous individuals who you don't really need to know anything more about, to obey certain laws and to adhere to a certain system in order to gain goods for oneself, peace, hopefully economic opportunity, and so on. So patriotism in a neoliberal system becomes something superficial. It becomes something very ideological. I was at a football game recently where they enacted the whole 9 yards, the reciting of the Declaration of Independence, or maybe it was the preamble to the Constitution. I can't remember, the national anthem and so on. But one got the sense that nobody there, what did it really mean? It seemed very weirdly anachronistic and programmatic. Patriotism, once it's mainly a product of ideology and not a product of loyalty to actual human beings that you care about, can also become very chauvinistic, as MacIntyre points out. That's why patriotism amongst left-leaning people has a bad name, because it has turned into this chauvinistic, aggressive mentality that puts one country first above all else. Okay, so neoliberalism cripples community more generally because it doesn't allow people to stay in one place, to develop ties to each other, to think about those ties as more important than, say, economic advancement. And if the community is transient and it is more focused on the discrete tasks that each individual has to do, then how does one instill virtues, right? Even it becomes difficult within the family, right? As the family busts apart, as there's more and more actual divorces, and if not virtual divorces within families, where the children are much more likely to not listen to their parents, maybe because their parents don't have anything particularly coherent to say. And if the larger family is at a distance from each other, if there is nobody in the neighborhood who actually considers themselves responsible for anybody else, which is of course the case, right? Most neighborhoods, nobody knows anybody else in them. So how do you pass on virtues, habits of being, to younger people if there is so much transience and fragmentation? And if you can't do that, then you can't foster character, that quality of a person that the Aristotelian way of thinking substitutes for a heavy reliance upon rules and law. MacIntyre says to cut oneself off from shared activity in which one has initially to learn obediently as an apprentice learns, to isolate oneself from the communities which find their point and purpose in such activities, will be to debar oneself from finding any good outside of oneself. So, we cut ourselves off or have been cut off from these shared activities, apprenticeship, okay, which for the carpenter means learning from an older carpenter, but for the human being and the citizen means just learning from your parents, your grandparents, learning how to be a human being. If we can't do that, if our society does not foster that, then of course we concentrate on ourselves. We turn inward. Okay. It disintegrates, neoliberalism disintegrates individual and community narratives. This is also an important concept for MacIntyre. In the fragmented world in which we live, we can't really even develop a narrative of our own lives. This is the Aristotelian virtue ethics framework, right? Is to develop a narrative of our whole life, to assess our life as a whole and our purpose as a human being, and not just our role as a worker and as a member of this group and as a parent over here and so on and so forth. So only if we can think of our lives as a narrative can we really think in terms of virtue ethics. And narrative makes us, as we've already seen, responsible for our past and our future, because our narrative is about our lives, but also about our nation's life. So last time, I talked about how MacIntyre basically says you cannot separate yourself. If you think this way, you can't separate yourself from your own nation's past. So if your nation engaged in slavery, as the United States did, then you are responsible for the consequences of that. If you are a member of the white race, for instance, you are responsible, not guilty, but responsible for dealing with the aftermath of what came before you. This is classical conservatism to the T. Burke said, we are a part of a social fabric. We are dependent upon what has come before us. We also are beholden to what will come after us. We are not just isolated in this moment. What we do now affects what will happen in the future. So we're responsible for our children, our children's children, and so on and so forth. And we need to see ourselves as part of a continuum. Neoliberalism disintegrates that type of narrative. It makes it harder for people to take responsibility. So Aristotle said man is a political or social animal. In the Aristotelian sense, this means, as MacIntyre says, my good as a man is one and the same as the good of those others with whom I am bound up in human community. So he wants to bring back this sense of we can't be fully human if we aren't members of, if we don't feel ourselves to be members of a community, a true community for which we are responsible. I find that very compelling. He revisits republicanism in these last few chapters, talks about 18th century republicanism. It's kind of interesting. He says, what is central to that tradition is the notion of a public good, which is prior to and characterizable independently of the summing of individual desires and interests. So it's almost like he's saying 18th century republicanism, which did end with the, American Revolution, but also the French Revolution, radicalism. That was sort of the last gasp of the attempt to bring back or to rehabilitate some notion of citizenship and common good. And it went off the rails, especially with the French Revolution. But he says it was an attempt at a partial restoration of the classical tradition. It's interesting. He talks about the Jacobin clubs, which of course we learn about them as elements that led to the horrible radicalism of the French Revolution. But he reminds us that at the beginning of this whole process, there was this notion of fraternity. That republicanism, which started, this modern republicanism starts with Machiavelli and moves forward into the incipient phases of the French Revolution. there was an idea of strong solidarity and fraternity. And I guess what he's trying to communicate, I think, is that that we should not basically blame or project back on those aims the entire baggage of what came after, not only the French Revolution, but the Bolshevik Revolution and Maoist Revolution and all of that. But there was a kernel there, a last attempt to bridge the divide between the ancient values and modernity. He says the true lesson of the Jacobin clubs and their downfall is that you cannot hope to reinvent morality on the scale of a whole nation when the very idiom of morality which you seek to reinvent is alien in one way to the vast mass of ordinary people and in another to the intellectual elite. You know, the French revolutionaries became enamored with this abstract Enlightenment philosophy and forgot about, say, you know, the history of the embrace of Catholicism within the French, and you know, just the history and the legacy of feudalism, and attempted to basically reinvent human beings and create fraternity or communal bonds in this very abstract way. And I think he's saying that's not possible. In order to really have communal bonds, you have to not abandon the past. You have to embrace the past. Get rid of those things that you don't like or that are wrong. But to jettison the past entirely is to set yourself up for this artificiality, which leads to extremism. So finally, at the very end of chapter 18, he talks about the goal. And this is really the most meaningful part of this book for me. Again, I'm not really interested in parsing it. I've done a little bit of that, but not a lot of that. I'm interested in what we can take away from this, because we need to redevelop community for a lot of reasons, but for our planet, maybe particularly for the health of our land and our planet. And so the goal ultimately is the recreation or creation of strong community. It really is for MacIntyre the rejection of liberalism and neoliberalism. So he's looking into the future, and what he sees, I think, is the beginning of a different way of life. So he says, what matters at this stage is the construction of local forms of community within which civility and the intellectual and moral life can be sustained through the new dark ages which are already upon us. Now, many people who are attracted to MacIntyre and Saint Benedict there think that the dark ages are upon us because of the issue of abortion, or because of sexuality, infractions, and so on and so forth. No, I mean, they all may be a part of this, but for MacIntyre, the new dark ages are the very neoliberal fragmentations, the bureaucratization, the impersonalization, the total radical individualization, the idea of efficiency, technical rationality that pervade our mindset and that lead to many of the issues that moral conservatives are concerned about. So he's saying that the problem is way more vast, way more vast than what these folks might imagine. The new dark ages are upon us. He says, if the tradition of the virtues was able to survive the horrors of the last dark ages, we are not entirely without grounds for hope, though. This time, however, the barbarians are not waiting beyond the frontiers. They have already been governing us for quite some time. And he's talking about not only our government, which is highly bureaucratic and does not allow for very much local actual community, but also our economy, which is also highly bureaucratic and fragmented and rationalistic and does not treat people like true human beings within the system, whether they're employees or consumers. It's very mechanical. So he says, and it is our lack of consciousness of this that constitutes part of our predicament. We are not waiting for Godot. Look that up. I don't have time to explain. But for another, doubtless very different, Saint Benedict. Saint Benedict, of course, is famous for being one of those men who would provide community, an idea of an order during the Dark Ages, an order for community within the monastery in his case. And so I think what MacIntyre is saying is we need people who can guide others into recreating community within the existing structure, just as people did in feudal times. Of course, they didn't rebel against feudalism. Who could do that? But instead, these people, like Saint Benedict, created cloisters, created new communities, and did the very best they could to provide structure for themselves and other people so that they could survive and so that they could hold on to knowledge and hopefully develop knowledge further while their society changed and went through these changes. Conceivably, we're about ready to go through, in the next 50 to 100 years anyway, some really drastic changes due to climate change, due to economic inequality caused by advanced non-market neoliberal capitalism. So we need to start thinking seriously about community and how to develop it and how to grow it within the structures that we have, or despite the structures that we have. Alasdair MacIntyre's book, After Virtue, provides us with a framework to start with. Not the answer, but a part of the answer. So I hope you've gotten something out of this. Next time, I wrote an article in for Harbinger magazine, or Harbinger Journal, on Murray Bookchin and Jungian psychology and Jordan Peterson. So I think I'll read a little bit from that, and then I'm going to launch into a new series on a book by Walter Brueggemann, The Prophetic Imagination. All right, see you then. Bye.